This is not an accident. If this video found you today, something has already started changing. You didn't stumble onto this by chance, and you didn't stay this long by accident either. Something in you, something quiet and wordless, told you to stop scrolling. Told you to listen. Told you that today would not be like the days before it. There is a reason your heart wouldn't let you scroll away. So take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the noise of everything else fade into the background for the next little while, because what I am about to tell you was written for this exact moment in your life. Somewhere, quietly, without announcement, without warning, something has been removed from the space between you and a connection you have carried in your heart for longer than you've probably admitted, even to yourself. Not through conflict. Not through anger. Not through anything you had to force. An angel just erased the person standing between you two. And I believe, with everything in me, that you were meant to hear this today. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you noticed it, that strange, quiet shift in the air around you lately? Maybe you woke up this morning feeling lighter than usual, without being able to explain why. Maybe you've had a sense, small but persistent, that something is about to happen, even though nothing on the surface looks different yet. Maybe an old obstacle that once felt permanent has started to feel oddly distant, oddly less important, as though its grip on your story is loosening without you having to do a single thing about it. None of that is random. Timing is never careless. Not in your story. Not in anyone's. Every video you almost skipped, every notification you almost ignored, every night you lay awake wondering if the obstacle in your path would ever move, was leading you here, to this exact sentence, on this exact day. What if everything you've been through, every complication, every third person, every situation that made your connection feel impossible, was never meant to last forever? What if it was only ever a temporary wall, placed there for a season, waiting quietly for the moment it would finally be taken down? You have been carrying something heavy for a long time. Maybe it's the ache of watching someone else occupy a space you always felt belonged to you. Maybe it's the confusion of loving someone whose path kept getting tangled with someone else's. Maybe it's simply the exhaustion of hoping the obstacle would disappear, only to watch it linger far longer than you expected. But hear this clearly, because it matters more than you know, the obstacle was never permanent. The waiting had a purpose. And today, whether you can feel it fully yet or not, something has finally been erased. Let me tell you about the angel. Not necessarily a winged figure descending from the clouds, though you're free to imagine it that way if that brings you comfort. Sometimes the word angel simply means an unseen force working quietly on your behalf, a presence, a nudge, a moment of divine timing arriving disguised as something ordinary. Sometimes it takes the form of a stranger's small decision. Sometimes it takes the form of circumstance shifting in ways no one could have orchestrated on their own. Sometimes it takes the form of a quiet internal change in someone's heart, a realization they couldn't ignore any longer. Whatever form it took, something moved. And the person who once complicated your connection, through distraction, through distance, through their own unfinished journey, through simple bad timing, has begun to lose their grip on the space between you. You may not know the details. You may never fully understand how it happened, or why now instead of months ago, or years ago, when you first started praying for exactly this kind of relief. But something happened. And it happened in a way that didn't require you to fight, to manipulate, to force anything into place through your own effort. someone has been thinking about you. Not in a distracted, passing way, but in a way that keeps returning, no matter how many times they try to look elsewhere. And now, with the obstacle quietly stepping aside, that thinking may finally have room to become something more. The universe has been preparing this moment long before you ever felt ready for it. Let's talk about what it means for an obstacle to be erased, because I don't think it means what fear has taught you to assume. When we imagine someone standing between us and a connection we deeply want, we often picture a battle. A fight to be chosen. A competition we have to win. But real erasure rarely looks like conflict. It rarely looks like drama, arguments, or forced endings. Most of the time, it looks like quiet dissolving, circumstances shifting so gradually that by the time you notice the obstacle is gone, it feels like it simply stopped existing rather than being defeated. Think about how ice melts. It doesn't shatter all at once, dramatically, all in a single moment. It softens slowly, quietly, often while no one is watching closely enough to catch the exact second it changes from solid to liquid. And yet, eventually, what once felt like an unmovable block of ice becomes nothing more than water, gone completely, as though it had never been solid at all. What if the person standing between you and your connection has been melting in exactly that way? Not through your effort, not through anger, not through anything dramatic, but simply through the quiet passage of time, doing exactly what quiet passage of time always eventually does to things that were never meant to be permanent. Now let's talk about the signs, because you've probably already noticed some of them without fully understanding what they meant. Have you had dreams lately that felt more like memories than imagination? Dreams where a certain someone appears, saying things that feel oddly specific, oddly familiar, as if some part of you already knows something your conscious mind hasn't caught up with yet? Have you noticed repeating numbers following you everywhere, on clocks, on receipts, on license plates passing by at just the right moment for you to notice? Have you felt a strange, magnetic pull toward a memory, a place, a name you thought you had successfully packed away? These are not coincidences. They are signs. Quiet, patient signs that something is realigning behind the surface of ordinary life, in places you cannot yet see but can absolutely feel. Your angels have been working silently, clearing away things you didn't even know were standing in the way. Removing situations that were never meant to be permanent. Softening hearts that once seemed too guarded to open. Making room, real, tangible room, for something honest and lasting to finally take shape. And what if the space you've been protecting in your heart, the one you never fully let go of no matter how hard you tried to move on, was never empty space at all? What if it was reserved? Reserved for a story still being written, now with one less obstacle standing in its way. Divine timing does not rush, and it never apologizes for taking longer than we hoped it would. It rarely explains itself in the moment. It only becomes clear in hindsight, when we finally look back and understand exactly why things unfolded the way they did, and not one day sooner. Think about every time you believed the obstacle would never move. Every time you watched someone else occupy the space beside the person you cared about and thought, this is simply how it will always be. What if those moments were never permanent truths? What if they were simply protective pauses, keeping you both safe from something you weren't ready to face yet, so that you would still be standing here, whole and steady, when the real moment of clearing finally arrived? God has never forgotten you. Not during your loneliest nights. Not during the moments you cried in silence so no one would hear you. Not during the days you questioned whether you were simply destined to watch from the sidelines while someone else stood where you always felt you belonged. You were never abandoned. You were being shaped, quietly and patiently, for a connection that required more depth, more growth, more patience than the one you originally imagined. Timing has never been about speed. It has always been about readiness, yours and theirs. And sometimes, the obstacle you feared the most was simply a placeholder, waiting quietly to be removed once both of you were finally ready to receive what was meant to replace it. Why did it have to take this long? Why did the obstacle have to exist at all, if it was only ever going to be erased eventually? This might be the question that has haunted you the most. Why the waiting? Why did it feel like everyone else's connection moved forward cleanly while yours stayed tangled in something you couldn't control? Here is a gentle truth, one worth holding on to. Some connections require both people to move through their own separate lessons before they can finally meet each other without complication. If the obstacle had disappeared exactly when you wanted it to, you might not have healed the parts of yourself that needed healing first. You might not have learned to trust your own worth outside of someone else's attention or someone else's choices. You might not have discovered the quiet strength you now carry, the strength that will allow you to receive this connection fully, without fear distorting what should feel simple and clear. The same may be true for them. Sometimes the person meant for you needs their own storm, their own unraveling, before they can arrive without someone else standing in the way, without confusion clouding what should have always felt obvious. The delay was never punishment. It was refinement. And that refinement, quiet and unseen for so long, has now reached the moment where the obstacle has finally, quietly, been cleared. So what is actually changing right now, in this very moment? Right now, invisible shifts are happening that are difficult to describe but impossible to ignore once you begin to notice them. You may feel a lightness in your chest that wasn't there last week. You may feel a strange, quiet calm replacing anxiety that has lived inside you for months, maybe even years. You may find your thoughts drifting less toward the frustration of what once complicated your connection, and more toward a cautious, curious hope about what might now be possible. This is not simply wishful thinking. This is what happens when something invisible finally begins to move after a long stillness. The obstacle that once felt unbearable, the third presence that once made your connection feel impossible, is losing its hold. Somewhere, quietly, space is opening up that wasn't available before, space for honesty, space for clarity, space for a connection that no longer has to compete with something else for attention. What if the erasure you're sensing wasn't just a passing shift, but a turning point? A moment where the distraction finally lost its power, where the confusion finally settled, where the truth simply became too clear to keep ignoring any longer? What if the space you've protected in your own heart, the one you never fully let go of no matter how hard you tried to move on, was never empty at all? What if it was reserved for a story still being quietly written into your life? I want you to hear this next part with your whole heart, because you deserve every word of it. You are not too late. You are not too broken. You are not too much, and you are not too little. Every version of yourself you've had to become, the patient one, the healed one, the hopeful one even when hope felt foolish, the strong one who kept going even when someone else seemed to be standing exactly where you wanted to be, was never wasted effort. It was necessary. Every single piece of it. If you've felt discouraged lately, if you've quietly wondered whether any of this waiting would ever amount to something real, let this be your gentle reminder: exhaustion often arrives right before a breakthrough, not instead of one. You have made it further than you probably give yourself credit for. You have survived nights that once felt unsurvivable. You have kept a small flame of faith burning even when everything around you whispered that the obstacle standing between you would never move. That flame was never foolish. It was foresight. It was the quiet part of you that always knew, somewhere beneath the frustration, that nothing standing in your way was ever truly permanent. I want to remind you of something else, something easy to forget when you're in the middle of watching an obstacle refuse to budge. Healing does not mean giving up. Moving forward does not mean no longer caring. You can build a full life, find joy in your everyday moments, laugh with the people around you, chase your own goals and dreams, and still hold a quiet, patient hope for a connection you haven't fully let go of. That is not weakness. That is not being stuck. That is simply loving something deeply enough to give it the time it needed to clear itself of complications you never asked for in the first place. There is no timeline you are required to follow. There is no rulebook that says you should have already given up by now. Your heart moves at its own pace, and that pace has never been wrong, no matter what anyone else's timeline seems to suggest. I want to gently remind you of something else, too. Your worth was never determined by whether someone else once stood between you and this connection. You are valuable, whole, and worthy of love regardless of what complications existed before today. This message isn't meant to convince you that your life only matters if this particular connection unfolds the way you hoped. It's meant to remind you that whatever happens next, you are already enough, exactly as you are, right now, in this very moment. Let's talk about the nature of obstacles themselves, because I think we've all been taught to fear them more than we need to. An obstacle is not always a permanent wall. Sometimes it's simply a season, a chapter that had to exist so that both people could grow into versions of themselves capable of holding something real without complication. Think about the stories you've heard, maybe from your own family, maybe from friends, maybe from strangers whose journeys somehow reached your ears, about two people who found their way to each other only after a long, complicated detour involving someone else entirely. Was it luck? Maybe. Was it coincidence? Perhaps, on the surface. But look closer, and you'll often find something more intentional at work, a string of small decisions, small quiet shifts, that eventually cleared a path neither person could have cleared entirely on their own. What if your story is one of those stories? What if the obstacle you've been dealing with wasn't a sign the connection was doomed, but simply the difficult chapter that had to happen before the clearer, calmer chapter could finally begin? Think about the night itself for a moment. Not metaphorically, but literally. Think about how dark it becomes right before dawn, darker sometimes than any other hour, as if the night wants to remind you one last time how heavy the weight of waiting can feel before the light returns. Somewhere in that kind of darkness, while most of the world slept, something quietly moved. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a small shift, the kind that doesn't announce itself with fanfare but changes the direction of everything that follows. Maybe the light reaching you right now, this feeling, this pull, this unexplainable sense that something has cleared, began its journey a long time ago, long before you were even aware enough to notice it. And now, finally, after all that distance, it has arrived exactly when you needed it most. Let's slow down for a moment, because there is something important I want you to sit with. An angel's quiet work rarely announces itself with certainty. You may never receive a clear sign that says, "This is exactly what happened, and this is exactly why." Instead, you may simply notice a gradual softening, fewer mentions of the person who once complicated things, less tension in conversations that used to feel loaded, a sense of ease returning to a connection that once felt like it was constantly competing for space. You don't need to know every detail of how it happened. You don't need to understand exactly how the pieces moved. You only need to trust that pieces are moving at all, quietly, patiently, in a direction that may surprise you. Imagine, for a moment, that your connection is a manuscript, and somewhere, an unseen hand is sitting with it, unsatisfied with the complications currently written into the story. A good author doesn't erase the difficult chapters entirely. They don't pretend the obstacle never existed. Instead, they weave it into something meaningful, allowing the difficulty to serve a purpose within the larger arc of the story. The waiting becomes the lesson. The complication becomes the reason both of you grew enough to finally recognize what mattered. If you think about your own favorite stories, the ones that moved you the most, the ones you still think about long after you finished them, they were rarely stories where everything was easy from the very beginning. The most memorable stories are the ones where the characters had to wait for their obstacles to clear, where the resolution felt earned rather than convenient. Now let's gently talk about what may be coming, because I want to be honest with you. No one, not this video, not any stranger online, not even the deepest intuition, can promise you an exact date, an exact name, or an exact outcome. What I can offer you instead is a reflection, not a guarantee. A possibility, not a certainty. Your life is still being written, and no message has the power to hold the pen for you. Only you, and the choices you continue to make, can do that. But here is what many people describe feeling in seasons like the one you're standing in right now. A conversation that finally feels uncomplicated, without the tension of a third presence hovering in the background. A sense of ease replacing years of quiet competition, almost as if the hardest, heaviest parts have finally been carried away by time itself. A version of the connection where two people can simply exist together, without someone else's shadow falling across every interaction. Some people describe noticing, almost suddenly, that the person who once complicated things has quietly moved on with their own life, no longer standing where they once stood. Others describe a shift in the way the person they care about speaks, acts, or shows up, as though something inside them has finally settled. Others simply describe an internal shift, a quiet peace that settles in regardless of the exact outcome, because their own healing became the real gift they needed all along. Whatever your version of this looks like, know this: the outcome you're hoping for may not look exactly like what you originally imagined, but it may still bring the peace your heart has been quietly asking for all along. I want to talk about grief for a moment, because I think it deserves to be named clearly here. It is a strange kind of sadness, isn't it? Not the sharp pain of a sudden loss, but a softer, lingering ache that shows up in ordinary moments. A memory of watching someone else stand where you wished you could stand. A quiet comparison you didn't mean to make but couldn't quite avoid. A certain kind of loneliness that comes from loving someone whose attention felt divided. If you felt that kind of quiet grief, please know it does not mean you were wrong to keep hoping. It simply means you loved something real, something significant enough to leave an imprint that doesn't fade just because complications existed. That grief and that hope can exist together. You do not have to choose between honoring what hurt and believing in what might still come. Both can live inside you at the same time, side by side, without canceling each other out. And here is something gentle to consider: the same tenderness that allows you to still feel that ache is the same tenderness that will allow you to recognize the answer when it finally arrives. A heart that has gone completely numb wouldn't notice the signs at all. But you have noticed them. Which means your heart, despite everything, is still wide awake, still paying attention, still ready. Grief and hope have a strange relationship. We often think of them as opposites, as though feeling one means you cannot possibly feel the other. But anyone who has truly loved something knows this isn't true. Grief is simply love with nowhere left to go in the moment, and hope is love reaching forward, imagining a place it might still be able to land. Both come from the exact same source. Both are proof that you cared deeply, that the story mattered, that this was never a shallow or forgettable chapter of your life. There is a difference between waiting in fear and waiting in faith, and I want you to gently notice which one you've been doing. Waiting in fear looks like watching anxiously, comparing yourself, wondering what the other person had that you didn't, blaming yourself for an obstacle that was never entirely your fault to carry. Waiting in faith looks different. It looks like living your life fully while trusting that whatever is meant for you will find its way back to you in its own time. It looks like healing not because you're trying to become good enough to compete with someone else, but because you deserve wholeness regardless of who else was standing nearby. If you've spent more time waiting in fear than waiting in faith, this is your gentle invitation to shift. Not because faith guarantees a specific result, but because faith allows you to live in peace while the obstacle continues to quietly clear itself around you. The universe has been preparing this moment long before you ever felt ready for it. And part of that preparation was teaching you how to hold hope loosely, without gripping it so tightly that it turns into anxiety. Your story is about to change, not because you forced it to, but because you were patient enough to let it unfold in its own time, even when that patience felt unbearable. Let's talk about closure, because I think it matters here more than we often admit. Sometimes we assume that an erased obstacle must look like an obvious, dramatic moment, a clear confrontation, a public separation, a clean and undeniable break. But sometimes the truest resolutions arrive quietly. A simple shift in circumstances. A calm distancing that happens naturally, without conflict, without anyone needing to force it. A mutual, unspoken understanding that no longer needs elaborate explanation because both people have already grown enough to see the truth clearly. If what's happening for you looks quiet instead of dramatic, please don't mistake quiet for insignificant. Sometimes the most meaningful moments in our lives are the calmest ones. Sometimes clearing announces itself not with fireworks, but with a simple, steady peace that settles into your chest and refuses to leave. Someone may be realizing, right now, that the complication in their life no longer serves them. Someone may be quietly stepping back from something that once felt important but no longer does. And when that shift happens, however it happens, know that it was never random. It was the result of timing finally aligning after a long, necessary season of preparation. I also want to gently address something many people feel but rarely say out loud, the fear that hoping again will only lead to more disappointment. That fear makes complete sense. If you've watched an obstacle linger longer than you expected, it's natural to protect yourself from experiencing that same frustration twice. But consider this, protecting yourself by refusing to hope at all doesn't actually shield you from disappointment. It simply postpones your joy while doing nothing to prevent potential heartbreak. The outcome either unfolds in your favor or it doesn't, regardless of how tightly you guard your heart against hope. So what if, instead of closing yourself off completely, you allowed yourself a middle path. A gentle, cautious hope, one that doesn't require constant checking, constant comparing, constant anxious energy, but simply exists quietly in the background of your life while you continue living fully in the present. This kind of hope doesn't hurt you. It doesn't make you fragile. It simply keeps a small light on in case the story you're living turns out to be more generous than the one you feared. You are not the only person watching this message tonight who feels this way. Somewhere, right now, other people are sitting exactly where you are, carrying their own version of this same quiet hope, their own version of watching someone else occupy a space they wished belonged to them. You are part of a larger, invisible community of people choosing, night after night, to keep believing in something they cannot yet fully see. There is comfort in that, isn't there? Knowing you are not alone in this particular kind of waiting. Knowing that across cities and countries and time zones, other hearts are echoing the same quiet question yours is asking right now: will the obstacle finally clear, or will I be left standing here forever? You come from a long line of people who have held on to quiet hope through complicated circumstances far more uncertain than yours. And if they could hold on, so can you. If this message spoke to your heart, if something inside you softened just now, if a small part of you wants to believe again after everything you've been through, write "I trust divine timing" in the comments below. Let those words become a quiet declaration, not a demand for a specific outcome, but a decision to release the grip of control and trust the process that brought you here in the first place. Let it be a reminder to yourself that you are allowed to hope again, even carefully, even gently, even after frustration has tried to convince you otherwise. You don't need to understand every detail right now. You don't need to see the entire picture today. You only need to keep walking forward, one calm step at a time, toward the peace that has been quietly waiting for you all along. As we come toward the end of this message, I want you to take one more slow breath with me. Whatever has been happening behind the scenes of your life, seen or unseen, spoken or unspoken, trust that none of it has been without meaning. Trust that the quiet movements of faith, of timing, of angels working unseen, are never random. They are patient. They are intentional. And they have never once stopped working on your behalf, even during the seasons when it felt like absolutely nothing was changing at all. You are not alone in this. You never have been. Every tear you've cried when no one else was watching, every quiet hope you've whispered into the dark, every moment you almost gave up but chose, somehow, to keep going anyway, all of it mattered. All of it was seen, even if you felt completely unseen at the time. So today, let yourself feel just a little lighter. Let yourself hope a little more freely, without immediately bracing for disappointment. Let yourself believe, even quietly, that the story you are living is far from finished, and that the next meaningful chapter, the one being written right now, possibly by hands you will never see, may be closer than you currently think. Thank you for trusting this message enough to stay until the very end. That, in itself, is no small thing, and I don't take it lightly. Before you go, I want to leave you with one final image. Picture yourself a year from now, looking back on this exact moment, the moment you almost scrolled past this message but didn't. Whatever has happened by then, whatever shape your story has taken, I hope you remember this as the point where you chose to keep believing instead of giving up completely. Not because belief guarantees a specific outcome, but because belief changes the way you carry yourself through the waiting, the way you treat yourself while the story continues to unfold. Whether the clearing that happened tonight leads you back to a connection you thought was too complicated to ever be simple, or leads you instead toward a version of peace and wholeness you couldn't have found any other way, trust that both are victories. Both are proof that you did not let the obstacle have the final word. Both are proof that you kept your heart open, even when closing it completely would have been so much easier. Peace is coming. Clarity is coming. And whatever is meant for you, in whatever form it finally chooses to take, is already quietly making its way toward you. You are not forgotten. You never were.